In the winter of 1838, an English actress stepped off a steamboat onto the humid shores of coastal Georgia, and what she witnessed over the next 4 months would shake the foundations of her marriage, her family, and eventually the course of a war. This is the story of the people she met there, the ones whose voices had been silenced, whose suffering had been hidden, and whose humanity had been denied. This is the story of the enslaved household workers and field laborers of the Butler plantations, as seen through the eyes of Fanny Kemble, the woman who dared to write down what she saw. Frances Ann Kemble was born in 1809 into theatrical royalty. Her aunt was the legendary Sarah Siddons. Her father owned London's Covent Garden Theatre, and by the time she was 20, Fanny herself had become an international sensation. When she toured America in 1832, performing Shakespeare from Boston to New Orleans, audiences packed theaters to see the brilliant young actress. Among those captivated by her was Pierce Mies Butler, a charming Philadelphian from one of the wealthiest families in the country. What Kemble didn't fully understand when she married him in June 1834 was where that wealth came from. Pierce Butler's grandfather, Major Pierce Butler, had been one of the signers of the United States Constitution and one of the most powerful defenders of slavery at the Constitutional Convention. When he died in 1822, he left behind an empire built on human bondage. His will contained a peculiar stipulation that his grandsons could only inherit his vast Georgia holdings if they changed their last name to Butler. Pierce Mies, as he was originally named, agreed to the terms. By the time he married Fanny Kemble, he had inherited 3 plantations on the Georgia Sea Islands near Darien, along with approximately 700 to 1,000 enslaved people who produced his rice and cotton. The plantations sprawled across Butler Island in the Altamaha River Delta and Hampton Point on St. Simon's Island, encompassing thousands of acres of the most productive agricultural land in the American South. For the first several years of their marriage, Pierce Butler made regular trips to Georgia, but never took his wife or their 2 young daughters along. He claimed the conditions were too primitive, the climate too dangerous, the accommodations unsuitable for a lady of her station. But Kemble suspected there was another reason for his reluctance. She had grown increasingly aware of the source of their comfortable Philadelphia lifestyle, and she was troubled by it. Growing up in England, she had absorbed the anti-slavery sentiments that were common there. She knew that Britain had abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, just a year before her marriage. She had befriended Quakers in Philadelphia who spoke passionately about the moral catastrophe of human bondage, and she began to insist on seeing for herself the plantations that funded her life. Finally, December 1838, Pierce Butler relented. He seems to have believed that exposing Fanny to plantation life might actually convert her to his way of thinking, that she would see enslaved people who were supposedly well-fed and well-housed, content in their lot, better off than they would be in Africa or in freedom. He could not have been more wrong. What Fanny Kemble witnessed during her 4-month stay, from late December 1838 through April 1839, horrified her to her core. And, critically, she wrote it all down in a journal she kept as a series of letters to a friend back in Massachusetts. Those letters, unpublished for nearly a quarter century, would eventually become one of the most important eyewitness accounts of slavery in American history. When the Butler family arrived at Butler Island, Kemble immediately noticed how inhospitable the place was. The island was essentially a massive mud sponge floating on the Altamaha River, perpetually humid, swarming with mosquitoes that carried malaria, surrounded by rice fields that had to be constantly flooded and drained through an elaborate system of dikes and canals. The work required to maintain rice production in such an environment was backbreaking and deadly. The house where the Butler family stayed was comparatively comfortable, but Kemble could see from her windows the quarters where the enslaved people lived, and what she saw disturbed her deeply. The plantations were managed by a man named Roswell King, Jr., whose father had held the same position before him. The King family had overseen the Butler plantations since 1802, and they had a reputation for brutal efficiency. While Major Pierce Butler had been known as a relatively moderate enslaver, someone who believed in providing adequate food and shelter and avoiding excessive punishment, the Kings operated under a different philosophy. They believed in extracting maximum productivity through fear, intimidation, and physical punishment. Historical records show constant friction between the Butlers and the Kings over treatment of the enslaved workers, with the absentee owners in Philadelphia often unhappy with the harsh methods employed on their distant plantations. What struck Kemble immediately was the poverty and squalor in which the enslaved people lived. Their cabins were cramped, filthy structures without proper floors, filled with smoke from cooking fires, infested with poultry and vermin. She described the house servants as being in rags, their clothes so worn and dirty that she could barely stand to be near them. The woman assigned to be her personal maid, known only as Mary, was, in Kemble's words, so offensive in her person that it was impossible to endure her proximity. This wasn't because of any inherent characteristic, but because enslaved people were given inadequate clothing, no soap, and no opportunity to maintain basic hygiene. They were expected to work continuously with no time or resources for cleanliness, then blamed for the inevitable results. But what truly devastated Kemble was learning about the experiences of the enslaved women. Within days of her arrival, women began coming to her, seeking help, begging for relief, telling her stories that revealed the systematic brutality of the system. Kemble began recording their testimonies in her journal, carefully noting their names, their ages, their histories. These women became more than statistics to her. They became human beings whose suffering she could no longer ignore. A woman named Fanny came to see her. She had given birth to 6 children, all of whom were dead except one. She came to beg that her work in the fields be lightened. Another woman named Nanny had delivered 3 children, 2 of them dead. She pleaded that the rule requiring women to return to field work just 3 weeks after childbirth be altered. The policy was standard on the Butler plantations. 3 weeks after giving birth, no matter the condition of mother or child, women were expected back in the rice fields, working from sunup to sundown. The babies were left in the care of slightly older children, often just 6 or 7 years old themselves, who knew nothing about infant care. The mortality rate among enslaved children on Butler Island was catastrophic. Between 1819 and 1834, more than half of the children born on Butler Island died before reaching their 6th birthday. Leah, who was married to a man named Caesar, had given birth to 6 children, and 3 were dead. Sophie, married to Lewis, came seeking old linen for bandages. She was suffering from severe complications and had delivered 10 children, 5 of them now dead. The principal favor she asked for was a piece of meat. Sally, wife of Scipio, had experienced 2 miscarriages and delivered 3 children, 1 deceased. She complained of constant pain and weakness in her back. Charlotte, married to Renty, had suffered 2 miscarriages and was pregnant again. The litany of loss went on and on, woman after woman coming to Kemble with stories of dead children, miscarriages, chronic health problems from inadequate recovery time, malnutrition, and overwork. Kemble learned that the enslaved women worked in the rice fields standing in water for hours every day, their skirts soaked, developing terrible cases of rheumatism and other ailments. The rice cultivation required workers to dig and maintain elaborate canal systems, build and repair dikes, manage tide gates, and plant and harvest in flooded fields. The labor was grueling, and done under the threat of the whip. She discovered that the infirmary where women gave birth was a bare earth structure, with no beds, no medical supplies, nothing but a dirt floor where women were expected to deliver their babies and recover before being forced back to work. Kemble tried to help. She distributed clothes from her own wardrobe. She gave out food. She attempted to teach basic sanitation. She secretly taught a young enslaved man named Alec to read, which was explicitly illegal under Georgia law. She begged her husband to improve conditions, to provide better housing, to give the women more recovery time after childbirth, to reduce the brutality of the work requirements. Pierce Butler refused. He grew angry at her interference. He accused her of disrupting plantation discipline, of encouraging insubordination, of undermining his authority. He threatened to prevent her from seeing their 2 daughters if she ever published anything about what she was witnessing. One of the most disturbing things Kemble learned was about the sexual exploitation that was endemic on the plantation. Roswell King Jr. was widely believed to have fathered several enslaved children during his tenure as overseer. Kemble identified them by name in her journal: Renty, the twins Ben and Daphne, and a man named Jem Valiant, whose mothers were enslaved women named Betty, Minda, and Judy. Betty was the wife of Frank, the head driver, one of the most trusted enslaved men on the plantation. The fact that the white overseer could rape the wife of the plantation's most important black worker with complete impunity demonstrated the total power dynamic at play. Roswell King Sr., who had managed the plantations before his son, was also said to have fathered enslaved children, including a man named Bran, who became a driver himself. Kemble was told that it was common knowledge that almost every Southern planter had a family of illegitimate children of color. The enslaved people knew it. The white community knew it, but no one spoke of it openly, and there was absolutely no recourse for the women who were victimized. When Kemble complained to her husband about the overseer's behavior, he dismissed her concerns entirely. The mixed-race children remained enslaved, their paternity officially unacknowledged, their existence a living testament to the hypocrisy and violence at the heart of the system. The task labor system used on the Butler plantations meant that enslaved people were assigned a specific amount of work to complete each day. Once that task was finished, the remaining hours were technically their own. But the tasks were often set at levels that required working from dawn until well after dark, leaving little time for anything else. And the consequences of failing to complete a task were severe. Whipping was common. Kemble heard about enslaved people being beaten for minor infractions, for talking back, for working too slowly, for any perceived disobedience. She witnessed the aftermath of these punishments and was sickened by what she saw. One woman named Psyche came to Kemble in desperation. Her family was about to be separated, sold off because of some business transaction. Kemble interceded with her husband, begging him to keep the family together, and in this one case she succeeded. Pierce Butler agreed to purchase Psyche and keep her family intact. But there were so many other cases where Kemble's pleas fell on deaf ears. A woman named Teresa came to her complaining about brutal treatment. When word got back to the overseers that Teresa had been talking to Mrs. Butler, the woman was whipped as punishment for daring to seek help. Kemble realized that her attempts to improve conditions were sometimes making things worse, that enslaved people who came to her for aid were being punished for it afterward. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. In 1803, Roswell King Sr. had conducted a census of the enslaved population, listing 540 people by name and rating each by their capacity for labor as a quarter hand, half hand, three-quarters hand, or full hand. This dehumanizing categorization reduced people to units of productivity. By the 1830s, the Butler plantations supported more than 500 enslaved individuals across Butler Island and Hampton Point on St. Simon's Island. Everything needed for the plantation's operation was manufactured on site by enslaved craftspeople: shoes, clothes, furniture, tools, barrels, bricks. The plantations were largely self-sufficient industrial complexes built on forced labor. The enslaved community on the Butler plantations had developed its own rich culture despite the horrific conditions. They had been there for generations, many of them descended from people brought directly from West Africa's rice-growing regions who possessed crucial agricultural knowledge that made the plantations profitable. They spoke Gula, a Creole language that blended English with African linguistic structures. They practiced their own religious traditions, wove sweetgrass baskets using techniques passed down from their ancestors, created music and art, maintained family bonds as best they could under a system designed to tear those bonds apart. They were not passive victims. They resisted in countless ways, both small and large, maintaining their humanity in the face of a system that sought to deny it. Kemble's journal documented specific names and ages, preserving fragments of individual lives that would otherwise have been lost to history. She mentioned Frank, the head driver, a position of considerable responsibility that meant overseeing other enslaved workers under the white overseer's direction. She wrote about Jack, an enslaved man who had been taken north by the Butlers and kept hidden away on an upper floor in Philadelphia, prevented from going outside for fear that abolitionists would inform him of his rights under Pennsylvania law. She documented the women who came to her seeking help, preserving their names and their stories: Fanny, Nanny, Leah, Sophie, Sally, Charlotte, Psyche, Teresa, Betty, Minda, Judy. These were real people with hopes and fears and families, people whose lives mattered, people whose suffering Kemble felt compelled to record. The tension between Fanny and Pierce Butler grew worse throughout their stay. He was furious at her for interfering with plantation operations, for questioning his decisions, for treating enslaved people as human beings deserving of compassion. She was appalled by his indifference to suffering, his casual acceptance of brutality, his willingness to profit from a system she found morally abhorrent. The 4 months in Georgia destroyed whatever remained of their marriage. When they returned to Philadelphia in April 1839, the relationship was effectively over, though it would take several more years for the formal separation and eventual divorce. For more than 2 decades, Kemble kept her journal private. Pierce Butler had made it clear that if she published her observations, he would prevent her from seeing their 2 daughters, Sarah and Frances. And he had the legal power to do exactly that. Under the laws of the time, married women had virtually no rights. When the couple formally separated in 1845 and divorced in 1849, Butler was awarded full custody of both girls. Kemble was forbidden from seeing them except for brief, supervised visits. The threat he had made was real, and he followed through on it. Her daughters would not be fully restored to her until each reached the age of 21 and could make their own choices. But Kemble kept the journal. She held on to those pages that documented what she had seen, the testimonies of the women who had come to her, the reality of life on the Butler plantations. She shared excerpts with abolitionist friends in private, and those friends urged her to publish, arguing that her eyewitness account could change hearts and minds. Still, she resisted, unwilling to further antagonize her ex-husband while her daughters were still under his control. Meanwhile, Pierce Butler's financial situation deteriorated dramatically. He had inherited a fortune estimated at $700,000, but he squandered it through reckless spending and gambling. By the late 1850s, he was drowning in debt. His financial advisors came up with a solution that was economically practical by the logic of the time, but morally devastating: sell off a large portion of the enslaved workforce. And so, in March 1859, Pierce Butler orchestrated what would become the largest recorded auction of enslaved people in American history. 436 men, women, and children from the Butler plantations were transported to Savannah and held at the 10 Broeck race course. For 4 days, potential buyers inspected them, forcing them to jump, walk, bend over, open their mouths, submit to invasive physical examinations. Families who had lived together for generations knew they were about to be torn apart. On March 2nd and 3, 1859, as heavy rain poured down and turned the grounds to mud, the auction proceeded. Auctioneer Joseph Bryan sold 429 people over those 2 days. Parents were separated from children, husbands from wives, brothers from sisters. Young couples who had hoped to marry were sold to different buyers from different states and would never see each other again. A Northern journalist named Mortimer Thompson, writing under the pseudonym Q.K. Philander Doesticks, went undercover as a potential buyer and documented what he witnessed. He described a young man named Jeffrey, 23 years old, pleading with his purchaser to also buy his sweetheart Dorcas. Jeffrey tried to sell Dorcas himself, vouching for her strength and work capacity, desperate to stay together. But Dorcas was part of a family lot that had to be bought together, and Jeffrey's buyer declined. The lovers were separated, likely forever. Thompson described a man named Elisha begging a buyer to purchase his entire family: himself, his wife, and their children Israel and Savanda. Elisha insisted they were first-rate workers, a bargain. Please don't separate them. The buyer refused and purchased someone else instead. The family's fate went unrecorded. The sale generated over $300,000, the equivalent of roughly $8 million today. Pierce Butler used the proceeds to pay down his debts, though he still ended up owing more than $100,000. At the end of the auction, he appeared with 2 bags of coins fresh from the mint, and gave $1 to each person he had just sold, a gesture described by witnesses as grotesquely inadequate, given that he had just destroyed their lives and their families. The event became known as the Weeping Time, both because of the rain that fell those 2 days and because of the tears shed by people who were being ripped away from everyone and everything they had ever known. News of the auction reached England, where Fanny Kemble was living. She was horrified, but not surprised. She had seen how Pierce Butler treated enslaved people, how he viewed them as property to be bought and sold according to his convenience. The auction finally pushed her to act. In May 1863, with the Civil War already raging and Britain considering whether to support the Confederacy, Kemble published her journal. Journal of a residence on a Georgian plantation in 1838, 1839, appeared in London first, then in America. Her timing was strategic. Britain was debating whether to extend diplomatic recognition to the Confederate States and resume cotton trade, which would have been an enormous boost to the Southern war effort. Kemble's journal provided British readers with a vivid, first-hand account of the brutality of slavery written by one of their own, a respected English actress describing what she had personally witnessed. She named names. She provided specific details. She let enslaved women's voices come through in her pages in a way that was rare for the era. Her account was powerful precisely because it wasn't theoretical or abstract. These were real people she had met, real conversations she had recorded, real suffering she had documented. The book became a sensation, and, according to many historians, contributed to Britain's decision not to support the Confederacy. Without British recognition and support, the South's chances of winning the war were severely diminished. In America, the book was both celebrated and reviled. Northern abolitionists praised it as one of the most powerful anti-slavery works ever written, comparable to Frederick Douglass's narrative and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Kemble gave public readings from the book during her tours, using her theatrical skills to bring the testimonies of enslaved women to life for audiences. Southern defenders of slavery attacked the book viciously, claiming Kemble had exaggerated or lied, that she had been motivated by bitterness over her divorce, that she didn't understand what she had seen. Some critics tried to discredit her by claiming she had been romantically spurned by Roswell King Jr. and was taking revenge through her writing, a charge that reveals more about their desperation to dismiss her than about any historical reality. Kemble's own daughter Frances sided with her father and against her mother. Frances Butler Lee, the younger daughter who had been raised primarily by Pierce Butler, returned to Georgia after the Civil War and attempted to run the plantations using paid labor. She published her own book in 1883, 10 Years on a Georgia Plantation Since the War, which defended her father's legacy and contradicted her mother's account. The older daughter, Sarah, supported her mother and embraced abolitionist views. Sarah's son, Owen Wister, would go on to write The Virginian in 1902, one of the most popular Western novels of all time. But what happened to the enslaved people? That question haunted the descendants of those sold at the weeping time for generations. When the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in 1863, the remaining enslaved people on the Butler plantations were legally free. Though Union military occupation of the Georgia Sea Islands had already effectively ended slavery there. Many of the formerly enslaved people stayed on the plantations, at least initially, because it was the only home they had ever known. Pierce Butler and his daughter Frances offered them sharecropping arrangements that were better than many formerly enslaved people could find elsewhere, but still kept them in poverty and dependence. Some of those who had been sold at the weeping time and transported to plantations across the South made extraordinary efforts to return after the war. They walked hundreds of miles, following rumors and scraps of information, trying to find family members, trying to get back to the community they had been torn from. Historian Anne C. Bailey documented the stories of 59 people from the auction, whose post-war lives can be traced through historical records. They rebuilt families, found lost relatives, created new communities, and passed down the story of the weeping time through oral traditions that survived for generations. The Gullah Geechee culture that developed in the Georgia and South Carolina Sea Islands preserves African traditions brought by people who were enslaved on plantations like the Butlers. The language, the foodways, the artistic traditions, The religious practices, the sweetgrass baskets, the fishing nets, the ring shout singing, all of it connects back to the enslaved communities that existed on places like Butler Island and Hampton Point. Many African Americans living in coastal Georgia today are descendants of people who were enslaved on the Butler plantations. They carry that history with them, sometimes with specific knowledge of their ancestry, sometimes with only fragments and oral traditions, but always with an awareness that their forebears endured unspeakable suffering and somehow survived. In recent decades, there has been a growing movement to properly memorialize the weeping time and honor the people who were sold. A historical marker was erected in 2019 at the former Butler Island plantation, acknowledging the hundreds of enslaved Africans who produced millions of pounds of rice there. Annual commemorations are held in Savannah, with descendant communities gathering to remember what happened, to read the names of those who were sold, to set out 436 chairs representing each person who was auctioned. These ceremonies serve as a form of resistance against historical erasure, a way of insisting that these lives mattered, that this history cannot be forgotten or minimized. Kemble's journal remains one of the most important primary sources for understanding what slavery actually looked like in daily practice. Modern historians have critiqued aspects of her account, noting her own racial prejudices and the limitations of her perspective as a white woman of privilege. She was not a hero in any simple sense. She expressed views about enslaved people that modern readers find appalling. She described them in dehumanizing terms, even as she documented their suffering. Like many white abolitionists of her era, she hated slavery without necessarily feeling affection or respect for enslaved people as individuals. Her motivations were complex, rooted both in genuine moral outrage and in the paternalistic attitudes common among her class and time. But despite these limitations, her journal accomplished something crucial. She preserved names. She recorded testimonies. She documented the systematic brutality of the plantation system in meticulous detail. She made it impossible for later generations to claim they didn't know what slavery entailed. And, most importantly, she let enslaved women's voices come through in her pages. Those women who came to her seeking help, whose stories she wrote down, would otherwise have left no record. Their names would have been forgotten. Their suffering would have gone undocumented. Because Kemble wrote down what they told her, we know about Fanny, who lost 5 of her 6 children; Nanny, who was forced back to work 3 weeks after giving birth; Sophie, who had delivered 10 children and lost 5; Sally, who suffered constant pain; Charlotte, who endured repeated miscarriages. We know their names. We know their stories. They are not forgotten. The Butler Island plantation site is now managed by the Georgia Department of Natural Resources as a wildlife refuge. Visitors can see the remains of the brick chimney from the old rice mill, the ruins of structures that once housed enslaved workers, the dikes and canals they built with their hands. The Houston House, built in the 1920s on the property, was destroyed by fire in 2024. But the historical markers remain. Standing there, you can look out across the marshlands and rice fields and imagine what it was like for the 700 to 1,000 people who lived and worked there, who created families and communities despite the system designed to break them, who maintained their humanity in the face of dehumanization, who survived and resisted and endured. The story of the enslaved household workers and field laborers on the Butler plantations matters because it illuminates the human reality behind abstract discussions of slavery as an economic or political system. These were real people with names and stories and families. They suffered in specific, documented ways. They died at appalling rates. They lost children. They were beaten and raped and worked to exhaustion. And yet they maintained their culture, their connections to each other, their sense of self. They were not just victims. They were human beings who loved and hoped and struggled and survived under conditions designed to destroy them. Fanny Kemble's decision to publish her journal came at great personal cost. She had already lost custody of her children. She knew the book would make her even more hated in the South and controversial in the North. But she published anyway, using her voice and her fame to amplify the testimonies of women who had no other way to be heard. The journal became part of the abolitionist arsenal, contributing to the moral and political pressure that helped end slavery. It influenced British policy during the Civil War. It preserved a historical record that scholars continue to rely on today. The legacy of the Butler plantations is complicated and painful. Major Pierce Butler helped write the Constitution of the United States while owning hundreds of enslaved people, and he made sure that document protected slavery. His grandsons inherited his wealth and his human property and perpetuated the system until financial ruin forced the largest slave auction in American history. Fanny Kemble witnessed the suffering that wealth was built on and tried, in her limited way, to do something about it. The enslaved people themselves resisted, survived, created culture and community, and passed down their history through generations. Their descendants are still here, still telling the story, still insisting that the truth be known. When we talk about slavery in America, we're talking about millions of individual stories like those Kemble recorded. We're talking about women like Fanny, and Nanny, and Sophie, and Sally, and Charlotte, whose names we know only because one privileged white woman bothered to write them down. We're talking about communities like the one that existed on Butler Island and St. Simon's, tightly knit groups who had known each other for generations and were violently torn apart in the name of profit. We're talking about a system so brutal, so dehumanizing, so fundamentally evil that even someone from the planter class like Kemble couldn't help but be horrified when she finally saw it up close. The weeping time happened in March 1859. The Civil War began in April 1861. Slavery in America officially ended in December 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. But the legacy of those centuries of bondage continues to shape American society today. The wealth extracted from enslaved labor-built family fortunes funded institutions and created economic disparities that persist generations later. The trauma passed down through families, the communities destroyed, the cultures disrupted, all of that has lasting effects that we're still grappling with as a nation. The enslaved household workers and field laborers of the Butler plantations deserve to be remembered not just as victims of a horrific system, but as people who lived full lives despite that system, who maintained their humanity when everything worked to strip it away, who created beauty and culture and community in the midst of suffering. They deserve to have their names spoken, their stories told, their contributions recognized. And we owe it to them and to ourselves to understand exactly what slavery meant in practice, not in abstraction, but in the daily reality of women who buried too many children, men who watched their wives be violated by overseers with impunity, families who knew they could be torn apart and sold away at any moment based on the financial whims of a distant master. Fanny Kemble's journal gives us a window into that reality. It's an imperfect window, clouded by her own biases and limitations, but it's one of the most detailed contemporary accounts we have. Through her eyes, we see the faces and hear the voices of people who might otherwise have been lost to history. We learn their names. We hear their testimonies. We bear witness to their suffering and their strength. And we remember. That's what they deserve. That's what history demands. That's what justice requires. We remember their names, we tell their stories, and we make sure that what happened to them is never forgotten and never repeated.